Hello.
Hello.
Yes, sir. You are audible. Yes, sir.
Actually, will you
Yes, sir.
start
Yes, sir. We can
or
start.
wait? Yes. Uh, Good evening to all. On behalf of Philosophy Family, I extend a hearty welcome to all of you connected with this digital media. Friends, I welcome all of you to the third monthly webinar on the topic Understanding Human Happiness from Greek Philosophy Perspective. Today, Professor Dr. Prashant Kumar Shukla of University of Lucknow has been agreed to be with us as the speaker of today's session. Friends, every month we organize monthly webinar on different philosophical issues concerning the crucial problems of human life. During the pandemic period, we have already organized more than 70 webinars on different philosophical issues as per the syllabus of undergraduate and postgraduate students. Friends, today the topic is understanding human happiness. For Aristotle, happiness depends on ourselves. It's the purpose of human life and goal itself. The happiness, as Greek philosophers usually define, the cultivation of a virtue. It's the cultivation of good moral character, which is said to be complete virtue. The problem of pursuing happiness is reflected in the philosophy of Aristotle, for which he has introduced. Aristotle has introduced the science of happiness. Today, Dr. Shukla will present a very lucid and nice lecture on this topic that I don't want to say more. But before the presentation of Dr. Shukla, it's my honor and pride privilege to place a brief introduction on the academic life of Dr. Shukla. Dr. Prashant Kumar Shukla teaches philosophy at the University of Lucknow for the last 11 years. He is the official visiting faculty of BITS Pilani, Amit University, and Bhatkhande Music Institute. So he is a brilliant teacher and scholar of philosophy. He has also worked in Stephens College and Hindu College of University of Delhi up to 2010. His areas of interest and specialization are classical Greek philosophy, postmodernism, and logic. Dr. Shukla did his doctoral research from Jawaharlal Nehru University in 2006 and postdoctoral research from Kapsodistan University of Athens, Greek. He has been recipient of many awards and he has been recipient of UGC JRF in 2001 and MH at the Greek government scholarship in 2006. Dr. Shukla authored and co-authored 7 textbooks, which have been very popular among the students and scholars of philosophy. And these books have been prescribed by Tripura University, Binoba Bhave University, and Jamia Millia Ismailia University, along with many research papers in the concerned fields. Dr. Shukla has been associated with Indo-Hellenic Society for Culture and Development, Athens, Greece, Center for Advanced Research in Phenomenology, USA, and American Association of Philosophy Practitioners. Dr. Shukla has contributed many research articles to various national and international journals for the cause of students and scholars of philosophy. Dr. Shukla has attended many national and international conferences and put his views on different philosophical issues, which may not be possible to reflect here in this philosophy family. Friends, we are happy to have Professor Shukla with us as the speaker of today's session. And we must offer our gratitude to Indu Madam for introducing him. And we extend hearty welcome for being agreed to be a speaker in the monthly webinar. I welcome also Mr. Debasi Sarangi to be with us as the moderator of the interactive session. Now, may I now request our speaker of today's webinar, Dr. Prashant Kumar Shukla, to commence his speech. Welcome, sir. Namaskar, namaskar, and welcome. Hearty welcome, sir.
Thanks a lot for such kind words, sir. I will try to do justice to whatever you have said right now. And thanks a lot also to the coordinators, to the organizers and Indu ma'am for providing me such wonderful platform and in front of such learned audience. The topic which has been discussed today, which has been proposed today, is happiness. Well, of course, happiness is one of the most coveted aspirations of anyone, a layman to a philosopher. But happiness sometimes seems to be a utopian issue. Well, there are 49 people present today in this discussion. And if we ask the question from any one of you, are you really happy? Well, most of the people sitting here would have a single response, and the response might be yes and no. Or maybe you can say maybe yes. The crux of the question and the response given by the people here is that we are still not sure about our happiness. Are we happy or are we not happy? But then we are hanging somewhere in between. In some respects, we do feel happy, and in some respects, we do not. There has been an elaborate discussion in the field of ethics and philosophical counseling on the issue of happiness, what is its nature, how to achieve it, and if there is feasibility of acquiring any kind of happiness or not. In case we are able to achieve happiness, how long will it be? Should we go back to the quantitative hedonism of Bentham and Mill? Would we be able to quantify our happiness? Would we be able to perform a mensuration for what kind and what amount of happiness we are acquiring? What would be the quality of such happiness? Should it be mental, physical, spiritual, philosophical, or anything else? Now, the issue in front of us has been discussed by a lot many people, but the concern is that most of the people are discussing about the issue from their own background, from their own context, and from their own understanding. The kind of view or the dimension I'm taking here is that of the Greek philosophy, and that also preferably early Greek philosophy coming up to Aristotle. It is worth mentioning here that I'm not taking the later Greek philosophy into account simply for the sake of being compact and precise in my presentation. Most of the time it happens that a lot of us, once talk about happiness, especially in the field of philosophy, confuse the notion of happiness with the notion of goodness. Are these two the same? Well, I have come across a lot many articles and books and other kind of publications where people talk about the notion of happiness in Greek philosophy, but sometimes they confuse it with the notion of good. At the very outset, I would like to clarify that the notion of good and the notion of happiness, though related to each other in a contingent manner, there is not a necessary relationship between the two. There are a lot many students who do not find it happy experience to sit in the class, but they realize that what they are doing by listening to their teacher, contemplating on the issues and so on, to be good for them. And vice versa, there is sometimes we are doing something good, but it does not finally produce any kind of happiness. but still it produces some other kind of feeling. Maybe we can call it bliss, maybe we can call it satisfaction, or maybe we can call it satiation. So the notion of sukh and the notion of anand and the notion of shubh should not be confused with each other. They are separate and therefore should be treated as separate. Most of the time we find that the Greek literature does not talk about happiness in the conventional sense. I mean, the sense in which a layman would talk about happiness. Maybe if I can dare to say, the happiness of a thinker or the happiness of a philosopher is quite different from a layman's happiness. And we have some far-fetched ideas regarding our notion of happiness. Keeping this kind of thought as a backdrop to my discussion, allow me to start with my PowerPoint presentation in front of you all. I hope the slides are visible to you. So the topic today is understanding human happiness, that is from the Greek philosophy's perspective. Well, I would like to start today's discussion with a question. This is the question which is put in front of not only philosophers, but any person who has got an inclination towards thinking about the issues of life, such issues which seem to be the perennial problems of philosophy. And this is precisely the question which was put in front of Socrates at his times. The question was, what is the purpose of human life? Maybe there are some people who would say that acquisition of knowledge is the ultimate purpose of human life. Maybe there would be thinkers who would prefer to say that seeking wisdom is the ultimate purpose of human life. Talking in the Indian context, we might also take liberty to say that the realization of the ultimate truth, darshan, wo bhi satya ka, that is the purpose of human life. Well, Socrates would say no. And if this question was put in front of him, and when this question was put in front of him, Socrates unhesitatingly said, well, the purpose of human life is ataraxia. What is this ataraxia? Why he prefers to call it the ultimate purpose of life as well as the ultimate purpose of philosophy? We shall come to this at last, at the time when our discussion is wrapped up, so that we can be in a better position to identify the purpose of human life with ataraxia. Happiness has always been a seductive issue for ethics. In fact, as we have seen in our studies, whether you are going through the virtue ethics of Aristotle, you are a fan of the consequential ethics of Aristippus, Bentham, Mill, and others, whether you follow the deontological ethics of Immanuel Kant, or you favor the intuitionalistic ethics of Butler, in all the cases, directly or indirectly, we are talking about the opportunity or the possibility to grab happiness. That happiness may be of different kind of nature. It might be my own individualistic happiness, a collective happiness, a state-sponsored happiness, a religion-preferred happiness, a spiritual happiness, the happiness of the Vedas, the happiness of the Bible, or maybe the happiness of a scientist. So anyhow, we can at least say this much, that happiness has perhaps been the focal point of and the most seductive issue in the philosophical discussions, preferably on ethics, though it has been discussed in other streams of philosophy as well. While many, such as Aristotle and John Stuart Mill, take it to be the end of all human activities, almost all philosophers acknowledge that it is valuable, if not essential, component of a good life. And up to this point, we very much agree with what Aristotle has said. So the crux of this one-liner tag is that though happiness is valuable, it is significant, it can be a component of good life, not a good life as a whole. And as a footnote, I would like to mention here, in the language of a logician, the term component has been put here very cautiously because component and part and ingredient are three different terms. Component means that particular section which has the possibility of being substituted by some other ingredient, and still the proposition would make sense for us. So here, for the time being, thinkers like Aristotle are believing that pleasure is one of the component of good life. In other words, maybe we can say happiness is a part of good life, but happiness is not the good life. Anyhow, since it is valuable and it has been committed here, and therefore we take happiness, its explanation and elaboration very seriously. But there are some ambiguities. On philosophical analysis, happiness proves to be as elusive as it is alluring. Such a wonderful quotation. As we have seen, first, though most recognize its significance, its importance, and its value, philosophers disagree greatly, mostly about just what makes people happy. Among the early Greeks, Socrates, as Plato tells us, believes that happiness is virtue, and he equates this with knowledge. Well, we all have been so much familiar with the quote, virtue is knowledge. But Plato himself in Republic sees happiness as a form of justice. Why? We will come back to this later. Plato's pupil Aristotle defines it as a virtuous activity which has both a social as well as a social dimension. So Aristotle is looking at the notion of happiness from the collective as well as individualistic point of view. The Epicurean and the Cyrenaic philosophers identify this with pleasure, but each school disagree on what pleasure means to us. In more recent times, we all are familiar with the name. Sigmund Freud states that happiness is immediate erotic satisfaction. So Freud is taking it up to the level of sensuality. Immanuel Kant says happiness is a moral exercise of duty. And then John Stuart Mill links it to the freedom for self-determination. So as we find, as many philosophers, as many schools, so many definitions of happiness, and of course, sometimes they go antagonistic to each other. So obviously, there are ambiguities present in the notion of happiness. But then there are some questions, and these questions are of philosophical nature. The first question which I face, and I believe most of us must be facing, the primary question is happiness for whom? Whose happiness is there which I am seeking? Is it my happiness as a person? Is it my happiness as a soul, which is distinct from the happiness of myself as a body? Is it that kind of happiness which the society expects me to achieve? Is it really not happiness, but the happiness of my family, my relative, and my close one? So I'm confused, and there is a big question mark. The second question, ought I to regard my own happiness above the happiness of others? And if so, then to what extent? Should I consider that the happiness of my own children is preferable over the happiness of other children? Well, I'm not sure. And even if I do so, up to which limit, which is the boundary up to which I can sanction happiness of me and mine over the others? I'm still confused. Maybe a humble suggestion is that you can go through a very brief seminal lecture of, that lecture was very interesting, and it said, should we have special obligations towards our own children? I will send you the link, and that is quite interesting in this context. And the third is that, if not, how does the happiness of others factor into how I ought to act? How does the happiness of others govern my own conduct, my own ethical action? Well, these questions are themselves so engaging, but they also invite serious philosophical deliberations and discussions on a host of other intriguing issues, such as, ought I to be just? Do I have a duty to help others? What part does love play in a good life? And even a very brief but very pivotal question, after all, is happiness possible or not? Finally, if we consider that happiness is an end of human activity, is it the sole end? If it is not an end, what role does it play in a good life? So we have come to at least one kind of agreement, I believe, that happiness is puzzling for all of us. Well, all of us desire it, but there is a widespread disagreement over what it is and how it is to be had. In this discussion, one of my prime objectives is to suggest a solution to the puzzle of happiness by looking systematically at what the ancient Greeks have had to say about it. Though different schools of thought existed and various solutions were proposed to the puzzle by these ancients, there was a common denominator to many of them, if not most of them, about these ethical systems. For many Greeks, happiness was a matter of physical stability through right use of reason. May I be allowed to say that once physical stability is achieved through right use of reason, it would be better to use the term psychical stability here. This I use as a base for my own solution as it slowly unfolds throughout our discussion. So we first of all come to the term eudaimonia. Most of us are familiar with this, and here I have a translational concern with this term, quote unquote, eudaimonia. What is the concern? Well, first, this Greek term that is customarily translated as happiness literally means blessed with good godliness. In the sense, once you are able to get the blessings, the support of the gods of the Greek mythology, as mentioned in Iliad and Odyssey, we would realize that for a common man like me, happiness would mean coming under the shelter, guidance, and mentoring of someone who is respectable, who is functioning like a role model to me. and that would be ultimate happiness for me. Even in Indian context, sometimes we realize that the biggest bliss would be to come under the shelter of God or coming to closeness with the soul, with the God. Madhvacharya would say, to come near the God, as in Vaikuntha Dham, would be the ultimate bliss for us. Well, the same kind of spirit is given in Greek mythology and the ancient literature, where the people do believe that eudaimonia is nothing else but to be blessed with good, godliness, becoming like God, going near to God, and staying in proximity to God. Very early in Greek literature, beginning with Homer in the 8th century BC, to possess eudaimonia was to be fortunate, daiva, prarabdha, or destiny. So to be blessed or favored by the gods. Specifically, I'm not using the term God here, but the gods, because as you know, the Greek mythology is so much full of gods, and you need not necessarily get the blessings of favor of all. Maybe the blessing of some, few, or even one would be sufficing to provide us happiness. This was often, if not mostly, perceived to be a matter of circumstances outside of a person's control. So I'm not sure whether the God is supporting me or not, whether there is a guardian angel hovering over me, looking at my actions, smiling when I'm achieving something good, and crying with me when I am facing something bad. So it becomes a matter of coincidence. It becomes my prarabdha. It becomes my daiva. It's nothing but sheer chance. Chance, it seems, plays a larger role in one's happiness in the early Greek literature. One has only to reflect upon how often the gods are seen to intervene in human affairs in Greek epic, tragedy, and even history. Well, as a footnote, I would like to remind you, we all have seen the movies like 300, Clash of the Titans, War of the Titans, and so on. And most of these theories show as if there is God who is so personally engrossed and engaged in human activities, loving people, hating people, and sometimes strangely even jealous of the people, preferentially the kings. So to get favor of these gods in one way or the other, either by our efforts or in most cases by chance, means happiness in the early Greek culture. But is it the same eudaimonia we the philosophers are talking about? Well, I would say no. The philosophical eudaimonia is quite different from that of literary eudaimonia or the mythical eudaimonia. It is only with the advent of philosophy beginning roughly in the 5th century BC, but is spelled out most fully by Aristotle in the following century, that eudaimonia came to be seen as something within one's own control. Within one's own control means we are then again going back to the discussion very popularly known between us, all the people of philosophy are sitting here, as the contrast or the debate or the paradox of determinism with indeterminism. Sometimes we try to find a middle way out by talking about self-determinism. Is it a standard solution, or we are just trying to settle down the issue in one way or the other? That would be a concern here. So let's go back to our issue. Humans came to be seen as agents responsible for their own happiness or lack of it. That's what a philosopher would prefer to say. So we are not only governed by chance. If chance would have been a primal factor here, well, I would never be responsible for my happiness or absence of it. With one's fortune no longer perceived to be a matter of fate, prarabdha, eudaimonia took on a new, less fatalistic meaning. So now, not fully but partially, this is under my control. For Greek philosophers, this happiness or eudaimonia is perhaps best grasped as the one-word answer to the question. The question is, what is the best possible life for a human being to live? The basic question with which we started the discussion today. It is exactly this sense of happiness that I am taking here, and I presume you all must be thinking about a question. So the question which we are focusing now is not just happiness, the happiness of the common people, but I'm talking about the happiness which is the concern of a philosopher, which is connected with the best possible life. And when I say human being, I categorically prefer rational human being. We also come to one more kind of translational issue connected with eudaimonia. There are some experts or commentators who prefer not to associate eudaimonia with some kind of happiness, but they take the other way around and connect this eudaimonia with a kind of logos. Is it not the case once we go through our consequential ethics class, once we talk about hedonism or utilitarianism of Bentham or Mill, that we find that though they are talking about pleasure, happiness in this context, but they are giving a very rational argumentative process or flow chart, not only to define happiness, but also to calculate happiness. So we cannot wave off all kind of philosophical arguments without taking into consideration the notion of logos. What is this logos? There is another Greek word that we shall frequently come across in various guises, that is logos. In philosophical texts, this logos is often translated as reason or our rational argumentative process. In general sense, this is the best we can do, but for the ancient Greeks, logos was a term pregnant with meaning. While it generally meant speech, word, order, report, reason, cause, end, explanation, and sometimes rule, among other things, it also meant, quite significantly, order, harmony, proportion, and value. It is interesting to mention here that for Christians, the term logos is still synonymous with Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ is nothing else but a human incarnation of the abstract logos itself. As such, this invites us to pause and reflect when we come across this term logos and various derivative forms of it in Greek texts on ethics. And I'm not sure which one would be preferred. But then the Greek philosophy again helps. My only concern here is to prove that the ancient Greek ethical thinking was robust, imaginative, and integrative in nature. It not only asks a proper question, but also attempts to provide such an elaborate explanation that the set of ideas are coherent and consistent with each other. That it had a deep concern for problems that touched the everyday life of everyday people. This, in large part, is why the Greek philosophers are still worth reading today. And it is not without reason that it is mentioned that Athens is the magnifying glass through which we look at the history of modern philosophy. And it is not useless to say that the entire history of Western philosophy is nothing but simply the footnotes of what Plato has said, A.N. Whitehead. Well, there are always difficulties inherent in the study of cultures that are long past, and that is also the case with the Greek culture and philosophies. These difficulties notwithstanding, there is the promise of substantial reward if we go back to our roots. As with the study of any different culture, past or present, the immediate payoff is a greater understanding of human nature through the common thread of our shared humanity. Let's come to the modern term, how the psychologists like Freud have tried to explain the term, and then we go back to our Greek forefathers to find whatever has been said in modern psychology has always been mentioned in detail and with a critical stance by our Greek thinkers. So in developing my thesis of happiness as integration, I hope to convince the audience and the readers of the significance of the overall Greek contribution to the pursuit of happiness as we undertake it today. As cognitive scientists today know fully, the human organism is a psychically complex, one of the most recognizable models of our psychical complexity comes from perhaps the most lauded and most criticized psychologist of our times, Sigmund Freud. In his most celebrated model of the mind, Freud breaks up our physical apparatus into three parts: the id, our primal self and the center for pleasure; the ego, agency for delaying pleasure to accommodate reality; and superego, that is our sense of conscience, which we call in Sanskrit as Swavivek. For Freud, proper human functioning involves a harmony of tension between the three parts that principally reduces to getting control over the inordinately strong hedonistic impulses of the age. Notwithstanding the strength of our hedonistic impulses, Freud believed that we could learn to tame them with proper guidance. In his prominent work, The Ego and the Id, he writes, quote unquote, thus in its relationship to it, where he means the ego is like a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse, with this difference that the rider tries to do so with his own strength while the ego uses borrowed forces. Often, a rider, if he is not to be parted from his horse, is obliged to guide it where it wants to go. So in the same way, the ego is in the habit of informing its will into action as if it were its own. Well, this is a classic parable, the classic analogy of the Greek times as well. To many of his contemporaries, Freud's insights may have seemed to be astonishingly innovative and novel for his time, but the complexity of soul was already recognized in classical Greek antiquity, as well as in the models that were remarkably intricate in nature. That is why let's go back to our beginning. Let's see what Plato is supposed to say. In Book 4th of Republic, for instance, Plato develops a tripartite model of soul. This tripartite model consists of three aspects, as we all know, where the rational part in a psychically healthy human being controls the spirited and the appetitive parts. Plato's pupil Aristotle in On the Soul gives an even more elaborate and complex account of soul, in which humans having a psychically based capacity for nutrition, locomotion, appetite, reproduction, perception, and reasoning are distinguished from other animals by their capacity to reason. For both philosophers, Plato as well as Aristotle, any account of living a good and happy life must deal with harmonizing the various and often discordant parts of the soul and maintain this harmony. That is why we mention order, harmony, and proportion, and this was the specific sense in which a philosopher talks about eudaimonia. For both of these thinkers, the harmonizing principle is nothing but reason, and the harmonizing agency is that part of the soul which contains reason, that is the rational aspect of the soul. A recognizably important way of acquiring and maintaining accord among the different parts of the soul is through self-knowledge. So this discussion, which started from happiness through integration, I have come to happiness through self-integration. In fact, one of the most celebrated rational principles for the ancient Greeks, know thyself, which was inscribed on a wall at the Oracle of Delphi, concerned just this. This discussion is about personal integration, is specifically what the Greeks have to teach us today about self-knowledge and why it is an indispensable part of our happiness. First, let us have the different accounts of the soul that Plato and Aristotle gave. I would try to show how for each, self-knowledge is a matter of functional, organic unity or true personal integration, where every part of the soul functions dutifully for the good of the organism as a whole. And this is something we call Platonic justice. Plato came to a conclusion concerning the human soul similar to that of Freud, yet his ideas antedated Freud's by some 2400 years. In Republic, on the analogy of the tripartite polis, Plato mentions an appetitive soul. The Greek mention says to epithumetikon, which means that soul which has an appetite to accumulate more and more, characterized by intelligence in such things as lust, food, and drink. A spirited soul, Greek terminology would be to thomitos, characterized by acts relating to war, preferably shown by the virtues of courage, indignation, resolve, and boldness. And then he comes to a rational soul. The Greek tradition talks about logistikon, coming from the term logic, characterized by regard for reason, law, moderation, wisdom, and truth. We learn from Plato that the spirited soul and the rational soul naturally function amicably together, while these two parts of the soul are naturally antagonistic to the appetitive soul. So, if we have to give a diagrammatic representation about the harmonious functioning of the three aspects of the soul, maybe Plato wants to say simply like this flow chart: there is an intellective soul, logistikon, there is a spirited soul, thomides, and there is an appetitive soul, epithumethikon. Once there is harmony between all the three, there is order, there is harmony, there is proportion, and there is synchronization. That is the place where we can presume happiness to be present. And that is such kind of happiness governed by reason, which Plato and thereby Aristotle are talking about. And then Plato tries to simplify it for the people through a visual display and analogy of the chariot and the horses. Well, this kind of chariot and the horses analogy is also present in Indian theories, particularly in the notion of Panchaskandha. So we would be interested in particular as Indians to find how much these Greek thinkers are similar in their thoughts to that of Indian philosophy. To help us understand the interaction of these three parts of the soul, Plato in his Phaedrus offers an analogy similar to that of Freud. He compares the soul to a manned chariot with horses. There is the charioteer and two winged horses, one black and one white. The charioteer represents the rational soul and is responsible for the non-violent, orderly movement of the chariot. The white horse is noble and good and represents the spirited soul. In contrast, the black horse is of contrary nature and represents the appetitive soul. Mark my words, while Plato calls the white horse as good, he never ever at any point of time mentions the black horse as a bad thing or ignoble thing. He simply mentions that the black horse represents the appetitive soul. So there is no question of hierarchy here. There are just two flip sides of the same coin. So we should not understand this as a struggle between good and bad. Plato points here, just like Freud, that human nature is naturally complex and naturally at odds with itself. It is no small feat for the rational soul to get the other two parts of the soul working together for the betterment of any person. Often, the best for which we can hope is, again, quote unquote, a very interesting kind of one-liner, not to stray too far from our intended goal. Maybe we can say nothing in excess. Now, this Phaedrus analogy is so rampant in Greek markets. It has been represented in all kinds of souvenirs in case you visit the place. So as you can see in pottery, this analogy which became so popular by Plato is present there. There is a charioteer who represents the rational soul, the logisticon, and there is a black horse representing the appetitive aspect of the soul. And then there is a white horse representing the spirited, the bold, the courage aspect of the soul. And thereby, once all of these three together come in harmony and synchronization with each other, that would be an ideal condition for Plato and partially for Aristotle as well. So here we come to the normative explanation or depiction of what Plato has said. There are naturalistic and normative points to consider here as they relate to human happiness. Regarding the former, what Plato, Aristotle, and in our own way, in our own times, Freud got right is that our psychical apparatus, whatever it consists of, is naturally complex and made of some elements that are by nature antagonistic in nature. Given this, and here I turn to the normative point of view, it is easy to see why personal integration is so difficult to attain. There is continual war with each other and within each of us that makes internal harmony difficult. The key to internal harmony for Plato and Aristotle is the proper cultivation of reason, and this concordance of soul Plato describes as the form of justice, which is of course conducive to happiness. He says, quote unquote, one who is just does not allow any part of himself to do the work of another part, or allow the various classes within himself to meddle with each other. He regulates well what is really his own and rules himself. He puts himself in order, is his own friend, and harmonizes the three parts of himself like three limiting notes in a musical scale: high, low, and middle. He binds together those parts and any other there may be in between, and from having been many things, he becomes entirely one, moderate, and harmonious. Only then does he act, and this is the act of justice. Now let's see, how does Aristotle differ slightly on the notion of pleasure? Aristotle too recognized the complexity of the human soul. At I.3 of Nicomachean Ethics, he speaks of the rational and the irrational parts of the soul. We all have studied this. And excellence of character for Aristotle involves getting the seemingly ambivalent part of the irrational soul to obey reason, not to fight it. The good man then has the parts of his soul working in perfect harmony towards what is good. Aristotle describes the personally integrated person as, quote unquote, each of these features is found in the decent person's relation to himself. The excellent person is of one mind with himself and desires the same things in his whole soul. Hence, he wishes goods and apparent goods to himself and achieves them in his actions. Since it is proper to the good person to reach the good by his own efforts, he wishes and does them for his own sake, since he does them for the sake of his thinking part. And that is what each person seems to be. Moreover, he wishes himself to live and to be preserved. And he wishes this for his rational part more than for any other part. And he wishes this for his rational part more than other part. And further, such a person finds it pleasant to spend time with himself and so wishes to do it. The decent person then has each of these features in relationship to himself. Quite interestingly, what we find here is that while Plato is talking about happiness of a collective kind, Aristotle is also giving an advanced version by talking about happiness of solitariness, that kind of happiness which we can achieve, which we tend to acquire once we are alone. So both kind of aspects have been talked about our Greek veterans. It follows that good living for Aristotle involves stability of character, and this entails a harmonizing of the discordant elements of the soul. Contrariwise, bad living is merely a symptom of internal discordance. Having shown that, both Plato and Aristotle believe that happiness is characterized by nothing else but the rational order in human soul. After this discussion, let's come back to our first slide, where we have talked about Socrates, and Socrates said, this happiness is nothing like truth, nothing like wisdom, nothing like acquisition of knowledge. Rather, this happiness, this purpose of human life is ataraxia. So the crux of his entire intention comes in Crito when Socrates says, all through my life, in any public activity in which I have participated, I am the same man as I am in my private life. That is the recipe, that is the one go remedy for our happiness. This is how we can acquire our happiness. I repeat, all through my life, in any public activity in which I have participated, I am the same man as I am in my private life. And this is ataraxia, this is calmness, this is sereneness of our soul, that soul which has got all the three parts together with each other. Now, what is the relevance for today? Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle had a broader and grander philosophical vision than politicians and thinkers generally have today. Theirs was an integrative ideal of binding people together happily for the common good. This self-integration, which finally leads to ataraxia, is essentially a rational process, starting from self-integration, going to political integration, and finally coming to cosmic integration, which we prefer to call it as a real implication of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. What a person does that impacted on none other than himself was deemed just as much a moral action as an act that impacted on others. So quite contrary to modern day moralists, the classical Greek thinkers are not believing that moral action is only that action which is performed in relationship to other, but once I am alone, I'm talking to myself, even in such a situation, I should be moral, because this personal personal synchronization or harmony is something which will later on give rise to societal political integration, and it is only in this process, through this process, that we can finally lead to integration, synchronization, or harmony of the cosmos as a whole. That is real peace, that is real happiness, and that is the philosophical meaning of eudaimonia, and what Socrates has said as ataraxia. Thank you. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much, sir. It's been a very fascinating and very engaging lecture. Thank you very much, sir. I hope there are some questions. There are no questions yet. So anyone?
If there are no questions,
sir, may I ask something?
Yeah, you can.
Good evening, sir.
Yes, yes.
Good evening, Prashant sir.
good evening, Manojji.
Sir, I just want to ask, as you are talking about that happiness is a integrated, self-integrated something, okay? Then what about the sadness? Is it also a state of mind like happiness, or happiness is a state of mind like sadness? What about what we can talk about the sorrow? It is also the part of self-integration, na?
Right.
So what is happiness meaning?
Okay. Most of the time, the Greek thinkers, shall I respond?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Most of the time, once we talk about happiness, we have to differentiate between whether we are talking about sensual happiness or the abstract notion of happiness. Let me cite with the help of an example for the sake of our personal experience. Let me ask you a question, Manojji, and that would be a very simple question. The question would be, let's say, how would you feel more happy if somebody gives you a party which was announced beforehand, or that party which is thrown to you as a surprise? Which one would you prefer?
So will you please repeat? There was some disturbance.
My question to you is that I intend to give you some kind of surprise, a gift. Which kind of gift would you prefer? A gift which I inform beforehand that I'm going to give to you, or that kind of gift which comes to you as a surprise?
Obviously, it is self-interest, not for
Most of
all,
the
but for
time,
me, I would both. Yes, sir. For me, I would like to have something which I desire.
right. So my response here is that most of the time we want surprises, we want some things unexpected come to us, but that always comes like a thrill and adventure as something
Yes.
which is out of the way. Since it is something out of the routine, so we get engrossed in that. But in the longer run, what I would prefer is that everything goes as per our predictability. Predictability in the sense I would be in peace with myself once everything happens as it is presumed to be. Most of the time, we find that. Can you please switch off, mute your speaker? Most of the time,
Okay,
it
sir.
happens
Sorry.
that if something bad happens to us, it gives a harsher impact to us if we are unprepared. But if we are prepared for us, most of the time, either it does not become a cause for our sorrowness, our sadness, or the degree of the sadness is minimized because we are prepared for that. Now, most of the cases Plato is mentioning, he's talking about knowledge. What kind of knowledge? The knowledge of predictability. If I am knowledgeable, not only about myself, but about the cosmos, but cosmos comes later. If I am knowledgeable about myself, then most of the things which will be happening will be of predictable nature. If I can predict what is coming next, it is highly probable that it will not come to me as a shock. If it will not come to me as a shock, the impact of the sadness, the impact of the sorrowness can be minimized. And in that case, if the different aspects of our personality are well synchronized with each other, in most of the cases, the outcomes or the results we will acquire will be so predictable, so knowledgeable that in all the cases we will find ataraxia, the calmness, the sereneness of the soul. That is precisely what the real pleasure is. I want my pleasure to be a secure pleasure. I want my pleasure where nobody can disturb me in the sense of threat or warning. The other kind of pleasures are temporal because they are mixed with something unexpected, something threatening, something thrilling, and something adventurous. Well, of course, I can go to that for the time being. But would I always want a shock? Would I always want a thrill and adventure? In a longer run, a philosopher would say, no, not at all. That is why this stability, this justice is something which Plato prefers to call as the real human happiness. I hope I was able to satisfy you.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you for this differentiation between the happiness and the sadness. But the little minor confusion I have that I I don't want to see a difference between happiness and sadness. In my not in my view, but as I think, both are the different degrees of human impulses or human state of mind. Happiness is not something getting happy, but as modern psychology says that both are the state of mind. I say like a chemical admixture. Okay. So sadness and happiness are not the two poles of same rope. We can say that both are the state of mind in some sense of human impulse, as I think.
Yeah, if I would have taken Epicureans and Cyrenaics, I would have simply responded to you that sadness is nothing else but the absence of pleasure, and pleasure is nothing else but the absence of pain. And that would be perfectly okay. But since I'm taking into account the Plato's theory and that of Aristotle's, these are the people who say out of chaos, we are talking about stability, order, and harmony. If that order and harmony are acquired, that is the state of justice. If that state of justice is acquired, that is what a philosopher would call as happiness.
Yes, yes, sir. No, no, good, good, good. I got your point. Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Mohin sir, are you there? Actually, he wants to ask something. Hello, Mohin sir.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, sir, you can ask.
Hello.
Yes, sir, you can ask your question.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir,
Yeah.
you are audible.
Okay. Dr. Shukla, am I audible to you?
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for giving a very, holistic approach. Holistic evaluation of Greek as well as the Western concept of happiness. Thank you. But I have some observation. In ancient Greek thought, we come across three models of happiness. One is divine model, as you have just mentioned in Homer, Odyssey, and Iliad. Uh, Here we'll come across also another factor that magic play a very important role in happiness, in ensuring happiness. It's very much there. Amply it has been given. This is one thing. That this is the first model. If we both divine intervention, so divine intervention we can acquire happiness, as well as so magic also we can get. Okay. Second model is that is particularly by the natural philosopher, the agenetist. They feel that real happiness of life lies in understanding the underlying nature and structure and the relation which makes the thing what it is. That's why if the Malaysians point out that if we can tell this particularly, if we can know the underlying water, that will also fine. Even in Democritus, Heraclitus says that underlying change in flux. That also provides happiness. And Pythagoras has gone to a different level. He says that, if we know the proportion, the underlying proportion of a harmony, the proportion that is maintained by the harmony, that also provides us happiness. And Democritus says that these perfect combinations of atoms, if we know that, that will also be there. That is, the model of because this is a model given by natural philosophers. But with the advent of sophists and Socrates, there was a change in perception about happiness. That is, ataraxia, that is the model of Socrates and Plato, Aristotle. Find that Socrates has given virtues, the knowledge, but Socrates wanted precisely to all his from all his interlocutors that what exactly happens. In most of his dialogues, early dialogues, particularly of Plato, in Euthyphro, in Iphilology, Gorgias, in particularly in that the Theaetetus, when Theaetetus gives a response to Socrates' questions, that what math, what knowledge is, Theaetetus came out with different examples like geography, astronomy, and so on and so forth. But Socrates denied him. Socrates said that you have to tell me what exactly knowledge means. So then that consequently a discussion goes on. Knowledge is opinion. That is a different thing. This is the way classical That way Socrates, sometimes got confused about what happiness is, because he also is not able to get some answer about what exactly happiness. So in the Apology, perhaps in Euclid, he has said that happiest man is who doesn't have time to think of his happiness. That's very much there in Apollo. So this is, but as far as Platonic version is concerned, I have no idea. That's the justice. That is the combination of this tripartite soul that gives, if you maintain that, and every class of people, if they maintain their duties assigned to them in their respective fields, they can maintain, they maintain the happiness, collective happiness of it. So that's it. But I have some uncomfort. I feel something uncomfortable in your assertion of Aristotle. Fine, Aristotle has given an individualistic view of happiness. If we maintain our own balance, our own harmony, then we can live. But Aristotle, at the same time, you must remember that he said man is a social animal. So collective happiness is somewhere there. Not only individual, okay, fine, one has to maintain his character, his sex. But at the same time, Aristotle says that man is primarily a social animal. That's why he cannot afford to neglect, or he cannot throw collective happiness to a backseat. Okay, so this is somehow, this is a rough way I just to draw your attention to all things. Thank you, Dr. Shukla.
Thanks a lot, sir, for very engaging remark. Let me put the things clearly. At none point of time, the term magic has been mentioned with reference to happiness. If it has been mentioned, it was of mythological or literary aspect, which has been mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation. Second, once you talked about Heraclitus and Parmenides, as Copplestone or Guthrie or Stace would mention, the issues of all philosophers before sophists were more or less of cosmogonical nature, not of the ethical or even cosmological nature. I mean, that has been clearly pinpointed. Forget about ethics. They were not even talking about cosmology. What they were mentioning was only and only cosmogony. So in cosmogonical question, it becomes quite difficult to talk about ethical virtues, whether happiness or justice or love and so on. The question comes in the forefront only with the time of sophists. As far as Aristotle you were talking about, I absolutely agree with you about the organic theory and the collective aspect of happiness, which Aristotle is talking about. And that is why in the last slides, in case you have seen that, thanks for your, very cautious remark, self-gratification or self-integration is just the first step towards the final integration, which goes through political integration that supports Aristotle, and finally it will lead to cosmic integration. So I am absolutely in support with what you have rightly said. It can be taken as an extension. So thanks for a very learned response, sir. Thank you.
Sir, you are mute. Sir, you are on mute. Please unmute yourself. Mohin sir.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Shukla,
Sir.
The natural philosopher, the cosmogony, yes, they put nature at the center of their inquiry and reduce the study or, the inquiry of man to a periphery. But little bit, you can see in every, in Democritian theory, when Pythagoras says that, that music cures our, music also cures our soul. This is Pythagorean statement. And Democritus also says that. Human good, he talked a lot about human good. So you cannot just set aside the ethical part, but maybe a backseat. It has taken a backseat. It has taken a peripheral background. but you cannot just rule it out completely out of their discourse. Dr. Shukla.
No, Mohit sir, what I'm saying is of a different kind of inclination. If you remember, even in the case of Empedocles, he talks
Yeah.
about the four kind of elements, but still he mentions two kind of forces and names them as love and hate. My point here is that though they talk about pleasure or happiness or love or hateness, they are exactly not that of ethical inclination as the trend started with the time of sophists. The other were mentioning it here and there in an indicative form, as you have rightly mentioned, but taking ethics as the core issue, this was the stance which started only with the time of sophists and refined later in the dialogues of Socrates, as we have rightfully mentioned. So that's my intention to present the thing. So thanks a lot for refinement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So questions started coming. So a question from Ajit Kumar Nath. He wants to know, is it advisable to behave in the same way both in private and public life?
Yeah, a very interesting kind of question, and this is the question I was expecting. The real happiness comes in the form of justice, if I talk about Plato. And once Plato is talking about justice, this is quite a step-by-step process. Whether you take Plato or you take Aristotle, they are taking soul in synchronization with the society and then in synchronization with the state, thereby the cosmos. So what I'm doing to myself in order to achieve happiness, the same kind of relationship and the same kind of functioning will be sought in case of society, polis, and then the cosmos. So while organic unity is seeked not only in our soul in the three aspects in case of Plato or the two opposite aspects in case of Aristotle, not only we are trying to maintain a balance between the two in our personal sense, but once we have acquired that, we go to the next step and try to maintain the same kind of synchronization or harmony as Mohin sir has rightly said, just like the musical instruments. So there is an orchestra, so there is a drummer, there is a mouth organ, there is a guitar. All are having different kind of natures. But if that orchestra is supposed to be successful, all of them should function in perfect harmony or synchronization with each other. This synchronization, harmony, proportion, and order are the thing which convert or which might convert chaos into music and music into chaos. So synchronization is sought not only as self-integration, but also as public integration and later on as cosmic integration. As far as public and private life is concerned, it is this precise idea of Plato which was taken later by Jürgen Habermas in his theory of knowledge and human interest, where he talks about the private sphere, the public sphere, and one more, the intimate sphere, and clearly mentions acknowledging the inspiration from Plato. Once these three states are in perfect harmony with each other, that would be the ideal state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Then next question is from Vijay Kumar Naik. He wants to know, does eudaimonia take the other aspects of the cosmos, that is a non-human world, into account besides the harmony between private and public life?
Yeah, very interesting. My answer would not be a straight away yes or no. My answer would be maybe. Maybe because of the reason that in case of eudaimonia, as talked about the first experts, let's say Aristippus, they are not taking it up to the public life. It is we, the philosophers, who are extending it, refining it further, and taking it to the public life. This is quite interesting. As we all know, Aristotle and Aristippus were more or less contemporary to each other. But since the aura of Aristotle was a bigger one, and at that point of time, Aristippus just faded away in the backdrop. It was quite later that we realized that the theory which was given by Aristippus was as significant as that of Aristotelian Nicomachean ethics. And we realize what he has said about the private life, that there is enough possibility that it can be extended to the public life. As a matter of fact, Nayakji, that would be interesting to mention here that there were many followers of Aristippus known as Aristippanians who later said, actually this theory, which seemed to be applicable only in the private life, is actually tailor-made, customized to function successfully in the public life as well. The same kind of problem as we find with the Lokayat or Charvak in the Indian philosophy. So there are so many similarities. Thanks for pointing out. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So next question is from K.O. Narayan Rao, sir. He wants to know, who is happy? A beggar on the street having a very deep sleep in spite of the noises and disturbances, or a rich man in a well-furnished house struggling hard to get even ordinary sleep? His second question, he wants to know, is happiness external or internal? If external, then there will be no finitely to happiness in the light of increasing desires. If internal, then why do we stay away from realizing this?
Yeah, a very thought-provoking remark here. Who is happy? Should I say the beggar or should I say the rich man? As a layman, maybe I would say that a rich man would be happy, but as a philosopher, I would simply like to say any one of them, whether a beggar or a rich man, who finds peace with him or herself. By saying that finding peace with him or herself, I simply means whose physical appearance and internal structure find a perfect synchronization with each other. It does not matter whether the person is a beggar or a rich man. It simply matters whether the person has got a well synchronized state, a psychical state, with that of the person's physical state. I'm not sure, because the term beggar has been used here as a stark contradiction or contrast. I would prefer to say whether there is a farmer who is sitting in his fields and showing and seeing his ripe crop, or there is a man who is sitting inside his air-conditioned room. I would say maybe both, maybe none of both. It depends upon how your internal world and external world are functioning with each other. As far as asking about whether happiness is external or internal, and you said if external, there would be no finality to happiness in the light of the increasing desire, and if internal, then why do we stay away from realizing this? Well, the response would be, our happiness in the Greek sense would neither be outrightly external nor outrightly internal. It requires both. Why should we limit ourselves to only one aspect? In fact, both of them directly or indirectly influence each other. Thereby, how can I be happy internally if the external world is not supporting that, or vice versa? So to prevent the ever increasing external desire for happiness, I have to look towards my internal aspect. But in order to realize the internal aspect, I have to realize the temporality of the external world. Once both of these come in harmony with each other, may I get the liberty to say, there would be acquisition of happiness. This happiness which would not come to me like a harsh laugh. No, it will not. But it will come to me like calmness of my persona, which gets peace with the others as well as myself. I hope this satisfies your remark.
Hello, Rao sir.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Then the next question is from Dr. Manoj Tanwar. He wants to know, isn't there a good similarity between Plato's three souls with three attributes and Indian Varna system? If we talk about the first three Varnas, Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya.
Here comes the controversial question. And that is the kind of question which is supposed to be taken very cautiously. My response would be, though Plato and Aristotle, or maybe in case of Vedas, or what Jehovah has said, or what Moses has said, have these people said everything correct? Was everything up to the perfection? I would say no. It happened with most of the philosophers, particularly those in the initial stage. Whatever they have said or preached or written, it can be interpreted in different ways possible. When Plato talks about the three aspects of the soul, or when Aristotle mentions about wisdom, courage, or temperance, they have a particular context in which they are talking. So we have to understand them in their backdrop, in their particular context. I am not sure whether you are taking it as the Indian Varna system or Indian Jati Vyavastha. If you are talking about the Jati Vyavastha, I would say strict no. But if you are taking the Varna system in the constructive sense of connecting it with the notion of Rid, Rit, Prarabdha, Nishkam Karma, Lok Sangrah, Daiva, then I would say yes. You have to remember that while Plato was talking about three aspects of the soul, he at no point of time said that these three aspects represent the three castes or classes of the society. And at no point of time, he tried to maintain a hierarchy between the three. And more or less, we have to remember, Plato was talking not about a human, but he was talking about a citizen. By the term citizen, Plato always meant a human which is not only human, but also social, not only social, but also rational, not only rational, but also responsible. So that human which is social and rational and responsible towards other can become the citizen. So these traits come or are expected from a citizen, not any human being. In the same way, in Indian Varna system, once we make this kind of distinction, that should be taken not as definitional, but as aspirational bifurcation. This is how the society should be run, that the people having specific kind of virtue should perform a specific kind of profession. Later on, once it becomes definitional, here starts the problem. In most of the explanations given by Plato, his explanations are always aspirational in nature and never definitional in nature. Whether you talk about the ideal state, whether you talk about the ideal system of education, whether you talk about the war, the catharsis, the pedagogus, and everything, this is what should be. Whether it is or not, I'm not sure. So these two, if you try to compare both of them radically with each other, I would say you are making a category mistake. I hope I'm clear, Manojji. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Then the next question is from Ratnakar Rajendra, sir. He wants to know how self-determinism is in between determinism and indeterminism.
Oh, a very simple and very popular kind of example, which has been given to me by my teacher, which said, If you have to understand self-determinism, just understand it by the game of cards. Imagine I have a deck of cards in my hand, and since the cards are, there are 52 number of cards and there are 4 players, I'm giving 13 cards to each player without knowing which kind of determinism is working with which person. So I'm not sure which specific 13 cards are being held by which specific player. What does it represent? It represents the classical theory of determinism or the prarabdha. Because maybe a good player or a good person can get bad cards, and a bad player or a bad person can get excellent cards. Is this the end of the story? It is not. Because the game is still not over, and we realize that no matter whether you have good cards in your hand or bad cards in your hand, it is the way you handle your cards that will decide whether you win the game or you lose the game. So a good player may win a game even despite the fact that the person is having good cards, and vice versa. A bad player might lose the game despite the fact that the person has got good cards in his hands. Up to the time, the kind of cards you are getting, that is determinism, and the way you play your card, that is indeterminism or the free will. But if you look at the entire game in its totality, that becomes self-determinism. So we are partially governed by our circumstances, but that should not be taken as an excuse. We are partially governed by our talent, our labor, our effort, and our approach in the right direction. That is precisely what self-determinism inspires us to do. I hope I'm clear, sir.
Yes. Thank you, sir. So there are no questions, as Dr. Niti Singh has rightly remarked that sir has left no room for any question. Everything is as clear as distilled water. So thank you very much, sir, for your nice presentation and nicely response to all the questions. So now it's up to Dr. Kailash Maharana, sir. Sir, please.
Okay, now propose vote of thanks. Hello. Hello.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, thank you very much, sir. Philosophy family conveys the sense of gratitude to you for joining with us and nicely present the happy life in the perspective of Greek philosophy. And I would like to thank our host, Dr. Pramod Kumar sir, and our coordinators, Dr. K.M. Narayan Rao sir, Dr. Patit Pawan sir, Dr. Kailash Chandra Maharana sir, all the participants who have participated in this webinar, and those who have raised their questions. Thank you all. And finally, thanks to again Dr. Prashant Shukla sir. Thank you, sir. Have a wonderful evening to all.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, close the meeting.